Good evening, everybody. I'm just going to wait for a couple of minutes while people enter the room before we get started. But thank you for joining us. I can see people still entering, but I will get started because there's quite a lot to discuss. Welcome to the High Seas Treaty Entry into Force media briefing. I'm Rebecca Hubbard, the Director of the High Seas Alliance. I'm based in Nipaluna, Hobart in Australia, and this evening / whatever time of day it is for you in the world, thank you for joining us. We have a panel discussion on the High Seas Treaty, its entry into force, and events coming up this year, or what the agenda looks like this year for the High Seas Treaty, and what the significance of its entry into force is. This session is being recorded, and we will share the link and media briefing kit later today. The format for this media briefing is going to be a panel discussion for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for open question and answers with journalists and participants. So as we go, if you have questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A facility, and we'll either address them at the end or they may get addressed as we go through. So I'll just start by introducing our esteemed panelists. We have Janine Coy-Felsen, Ambassador and Permanent Representative for the Permanent Mission of Belize to the UN and the BBNJ PrepCom Co-Chair. Thank you for joining us, Janine, and for jumping from your previous BBNJ webinar just moments ago. Also, her co-chair, Mr. Adam McCarthy, Chief Counsel and First Assistant Secretary at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia. Thank you also, Adam, for joining us. It is a very busy time for anybody working on BBNJ. It's such an early time of the year. We also have Riza Sakradahukos, the Asia Regional Coordinator for High Seas Alliance, and Takao Ferrer, the Area-Based Management Tool or Marine Protected Area Coordinator for the High Seas Alliance. So just to get started, I will do a little bit of context setting and give an overview of where we're at right now. So in terms of the High Seas Treaty, we reached the magic number of 60 ratifications on the 19th of September last year during the UNGA High Level Week, and this triggered the entry into force of the High Seas Treaty, which comes exactly 120 days later than after the 60th ratification, which will be this Saturday, the 17th of January. We now have 81 states or parties that have ratified the treaty, and 145 states have ratified the treaty, indicating their intention to, sorry, did I say ratified? 145 countries that have signed the treaty, indicating their intention to ratify or become parties to the treaty. As part of the agreement or the treaty, the first conference of the parties for the treaty is required to occur within 1 year of its entry into force. So that is from this Saturday. And I think just in terms of other things that are happening this year that are very significant is the continuation of the Preparatory Commission meetings, or otherwise known as the PrepCom, with the third and final PrepCom meeting in the second half of March, which is really key and essential to designing the institutional setup and the decision-making processes for how the treaty will operate going forward. So that's just a little bit of an overview in terms of the agenda for the year, and we'll dive more deeply into each of those issues. And I just wanted to, at the outset, also comment on the fact that we, as I mentioned, have 81 ratifications and 145 signatories to the treaty. And whilst we only needed 60 for it to enter into force, obviously it's really critical for its implementation and for it to be as effective as possible for us to achieve global or universal ratification of the treaty. So we're really aiming for all UN member states to ratify the treaty. And we'll talk in more detail about the significance and what that means for states. I just did want to highlight that we have had a big rush, even since the UNGA high-level meeting in September, with another 20 countries ratifying, including some of those big and important, both geopolitically, but also to maritime industries. Some of those bigger states, such as China, Brazil, and Japan, ratifying in just the last couple of months. So there's still a lot of political momentum, and other significant states such as India, the UK, and Germany, who are also, and I'd like to mention Australia as my home country, also planning to ratify by the first COP. So there's a lot of more momentum in the works. But with that, I'll just start the panel discussion, and I'll start with Riza. Can you explain for people what entry into force actually means and what will actually change on the 17th of January for countries that have ratified? Like, what actually happens? What do they need to do? And does it make any difference to participating in the PrepCom?
Thanks so much, Beck, for that very detailed and comprehensive context. So, the entry into force of the BBNJ agreement means that it will become an international law. Its provisions become legally binding for countries who have ratified or acceded to the agreement, and which also means that all state parties, those 81 countries that are on the UN website now, are needed to comply or fulfill their obligations under the BBNJ. So, on January 17, it will be a historical moment for the ocean. It's the first time that we have a legal framework to protect half of our planet. And it is also a once-in-a-generation opportunity to achieve a greater ocean protection. And speaking of obligations, upon the entry into force of BBNJ, it will usher several of these obligations that will take into effect immediately. And some of these include on environmental impact assessment, for example. It is the obligation of state parties to perform EIA if there's any planned activity in areas beyond national jurisdiction or any activity within national jurisdiction that poses significant impact in the high seas. And part of this obligation too is the timely public notification through the Secretariat and the clearinghouse mechanism. And so all parties are expected to abide with the transparency requirements of BBNJ. And then state parties are also required to take necessary policy measures to ensure the timely notification, reporting, and sharing of benefits on any marine genetic resources activities. So, for example, a research cruise is planned in the high seas. This information needs to be available through the clearinghouse mechanism and then through the Secretariat as well in advance prior to the cruise. And lastly, which I think is probably one of the more important and could be observed even before the entry into force of the agreement, is the principle on the cooperation. It is the obligation of the state parties to promote BBNJ objectives when participating in any decision-making processes or meeting in any relevant conventions, agreements, or frameworks. And I must say that this is a very significant step towards a more coordinated and aligned multilateral efforts to protect our shared ocean as well. And of course, still under the cooperation principle of the BBNJ agreement, the agreement says that parties shall promote international cooperation in marine scientific research, and it includes the development and transfer of marine technology as long as it's consistent with the principle of the UNCLOS. And this is really a part of one of the pillars of the agreement, which is the capacity building and transfer of marine technology through cooperation in marine scientific research. And included in this aspect is having the best available science on establishing area-based management tools, even if high seas MPA proposals are yet to be submitted. So while some of these obligations are dependent on operationalization of institutions or committees under BBNJ and mechanisms such as secretariat and clearinghouse mechanism, not all of them are. And one of the good example is the cooperation. There are many actionable examples that under this provision, BBNJ parties could already take action from here on. And in terms of how the entry into force will affect participation of countries in PrepCom meeting, this definitely means that in the third BBNJ PrepCom this March 23, countries who didn't sign yet the agreement cannot participate in the decision making. They can definitely attend the meeting, but only signatories and parties to the agreement can be part of the decision making. So I think I'll leave it at that and happy to elaborate further later.
Thanks, Riza. So that's what's going to be happening from Saturday. But as I mentioned, the PrepCom process is underway. And the PrepCom is discussing a number of things that are relevant to the entry into force and states' obligations. Maybe I can go to you, Janine, to give particularly journalists here who maybe don't know so much of the details about the treaty and don't necessarily follow the day-to-day negotiations. What exactly is the PrepCom doing right now, and why is it so important for getting the treaty off the ground and operating?
Thanks, Rebecca, and Reza for introducing and providing the context of where we are in relation to the BBNJ agreement, which has been a major milestone, not only for ocean governance, but certainly for multilateralism. And we celebrate it, and we'll be celebrating certainly when it enters into force. Entry into force means, as Reza has pointed out, there are several obligations that then come into play. And there are institutions that were crafted within the agreement to support the implementation of those obligations. They're the arrangement that make the treaty or the agreement work, that make it function. But they don't just stand up on their own on January 17th. There has to be a process that helps that forward. So that's basically where the Preparatory Commission, or as we call it, the PrepCom, comes in. The good thing is that the agreement actually set out certain matters that would have to be in play by COP1 in order for the agreement to function. So the Commission already had some instructions to work off of. And then parties, delegations, states, and other stakeholders also suggested that there were some other issues that would be important to be addressed by the Commission in order for the agreement to be functional from the time it enters into force. So, in addition to issues around institutional arrangements, designing institutional arrangements for the BBNJ, including its secretariat, matters relating to the conference of the parties and the subsidiary bodies, one of which is the scientific and technical body. We're also looking at mechanisms that will support states with implementation. Something that's really central, sort of like the central processing unit for the agreement, is the clearinghouse mechanism. So that's something that was additional. And in fact, Adam and I just had a briefing on work that's being done to support the integration of the clearinghouse mechanism into the BBNJ complex. So the Preparatory Commission met already twice. We started laying out the groundwork for I don't like to use this term because Adam has christened it as something that trips us every time we say it, but operationalization of the agreement. Um, and we're now at a critical stage because with the entry into force, the Preparatory Commission is at a pretty much definitive moment for the agreement. So the Preparatory Commission is meeting for its third and hopefully final session, where we will tidy up those rules that are necessary for the conference of the parties to convene, for the subsidiary bodies to be able to start undertaking work, and for states to be able to begin implementation, including through matters relating to funding processes, reporting processes, and as Reza pointed out, importantly, cooperation processes. So that's where we are.
Excellent. Thanks, Janine. Obviously, incredibly important and urgent now that the treaty is entering into force. And thank you for highlighting, I'm sorry, that it is a celebration that the treaty is entering into force and that it is an incredibly significant milestone moment that we are on the cusp of. It's so very true. So, Adam, as the other co-chair, and really, I mean, as Janine's pointed out, there's a lot of things that are being discussed in the PrepCom. There's a lot of details around decision-making procedures and committees and who sits on committees and key issues for the functioning of the treaty. It's a really challenging role when you're dealing with so many different countries and a number of issues that are important. What do you think is key to ensuring a unified vision and consensus amongst so many countries and moving those countries forward in this process of finding agreement?
Look, thanks, Beck. It's a really good question, and of course, it's a challenge. I mean, we're sitting there with 140 countries in the room, and looking at it from the perspective of the chair, it's completely different from the perspective of, say, being, I'm sitting there in the chair. I'm not representing Australia, and you get a different outlook on the international community writ large when you're in that position. Having said that, while it's a challenge, I don't think it's impossibly hard, in the sense that I think there's a very strong recognition in the room that this is, a really historic agreement. As we know, it's 2/3 of the ocean. It's half the surface of the planet that for the first time will have a comprehensive legal regime. And I think there's a strong commitment to the agreement that flows from a recognition of the importance of the agreement in terms of the protection of the oceans, that flows from the importance of it in underlining, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and also, really is kind of a hallmark achievement for multilateralism at a really important time. And so I think while there's 140 states in the room, they'll have different views and perspectives. Everyone's committed to the concept of the BBNJ and to turning that into a reality, which is exactly what the job of the PrepCom is. And so, of course, at the margins, there are differences in how groups of states see the BBNJ agreement operating in practice. Of course, there are going to be differences of views that need to be bridged, but there's nothing that's kind of with goodwill and a commitment to the objectives of the agreement overall, and I think the role of the agreement that can't be bridged. And so I think that's where we are. There's still some gaps that have to be filled in, but there remains, I think, a very, very strong commitment to taking. I mean, any treaty is words on a page until it's implemented, and so this is the process of building the institutions, building the bricks and mortar and the sinews that will run this regime. And I think, given that there's a commitment to the regime as a whole, we'll bridge all of those gaps. So I'm like Janine, I'm very confident.
Yeah, I think it's worth highlighting and emphasizing, as you said, the support that BBNJ or the High Seas Treaty has from so many countries, from all regions around the world, right? We've got, of all those countries that have ratified already and signed, we've got really significant and smaller, like big and large, developed and developing, maritime and landlocked countries from all regions of the world who really supported and engaged in the treaty. And it really does, at this point, as you say, I think for many people, particularly at this very challenging time in global politics, really offers a bit of a hope spot for multilateralism. And certainly that's been the vibe, shall we call it, at the previous PrepCom meetings. Having said that, there are a couple of contentious issues. So maybe for the benefit of the journalists who don't go through those detailed negotiations, could you, Adam or Janine, maybe highlight what you think some of the most contentious or challenging issues are that we're facing in the negotiations? And as well, of course, I know that you're both very optimistic about resolving those, and I think all of us are. But if you see any clear signposts for how we will address those challenges.
I can begin to respond, and Adam, I'm happy to have you come in too as well. I would like to frame it but more as, what is the context within which this BBNJ agreement has to operate. It's, as Adam pointed out, it is a big space. It is a significant space covering half of the planet. And it already has quite a number of entities working in that space. Not in a comprehensive manner in which the BBNJ is intended to be, but it already has many different entities working in that space and working on some of the issues like biodiversity that the BBNJ addresses. So we have sort of some precedents on how things could work, and we certainly want to see that, and many participants in the Preparatory Commission want to see precedent guide the development of institutions and the functionality of the BBNJ agreement. But there's a tension as to how far precedent should be prescriptive. And so, there are aspects or maybe contentious issues on the extent to which perhaps the BBNJ agreement should follow what is done, let's say, in the CBD, or that it should follow what obtains in the financial arrangements under a climate agreement with the Global Environment Facility, for instance. So there is that tension over how far can we be innovative. But as Adam said, there is this commitment to try to craft this BBNJ agreement in a way that it realizes its potential. So whilst there is some contention over how far we will be held to precedent, there is also recognition that this BBNJ agreement has quite a bit to contribute um, to enhancing overall global ocean governance, especially in the areas in conservation and sustainable use. So that's one angle. The second angle, it really comes from an underlying tension for the BBNJ that is very much definitive within the agreement itself, and that's in how we treat with the balance between the common heritage aspects and the freedom of the high seas. And that's more in terms of the extent to which there is the global governance architecture is prescriptive in processes. How much might we determine within the context of the institutions and the processes of the institutions that could limit the manner in which the activities are carried out in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. Those perhaps will not necessarily come out in the discussion that we have, but they're certainly underlying much of what we discuss in the BBNJ context in the Preparatory Commission. You might see that coming into play in the discussions on rules of procedures for the Conference of the Parties and what agenda setting might look like. And finally, because BBNJ, the areas beyond national jurisdiction, as I mentioned at the outset, involve multiple stakeholders, there is some tension around how the role of non-state actors will be taken into account in the processes of the BBNJ. And I think that's the third aspect of the tensions. But Adam, if you want to just jump in.
I would agree with all of that, and I would maybe make the same point through a related prism. I mean, the BBNJ is a big vision, and I think sometimes it's easy to lose track of how big it is. And there's two implications of the size of that vision. One is that it attempts to do a whole range of things that are new for the international community to attempt to do. So, if you negotiate a trade agreement, it's difficult, or a disarmament agreement, it's difficult, but there's a lot of precedent. There's a lot of things that have gone before, whereas the BBNJ is going into some really new areas for the international community. And I think the second aspect of that breadth is, by definition, because of the ambitiousness of the agreement, it therefore touches upon a wide array of other institutions and agreements and other things that are done in various places. So, one of the more contentious issues is there's a lot of sort of institutions and agreements that are already out there that cover bits and pieces of parts that touch on what the BBNJ does, and figuring out what the relationship will be between those, is another area of contention. So it is new. It is quite, to use the term, it's quite greenfields, I suppose. But there are some new things that the international community is attempting to do with BBNJ, and therefore that does bring with it challenges.
Thank you both. I think excellent summary of the contentious issues, certainly that we saw as civil society participants during the negotiations. And that conflict, as you say, between that big vision, that new, ambitious, and holistic goal of what BBNJ offers and what countries and all other stakeholders have really got behind, but turning that into reality. And as you said, Janine, really using precedents of other international agreements or other frameworks and bodies and forums as a guide, but not being limited by them, so as to limit the ability to achieve the ambition of BBNJ. Riza, did you want to maybe say a couple of words about some of the issues that civil society actors highlighted as big ticket issues to be dealt with during this next PrepCom meeting?
Yeah, sure, Beck. I think the observer participation remains to be the priority, if not the top one of the priority and biggest issue for civil society and the upcoming PrepCom this March. Because in the history of the BBNJ, civil society has been consistently a credible source of knowledge and expertise, and it has complemented well the expertise of the government delegations during the negotiation. And also it adds a strong layer of transparency and legitimacy in the process. And then even after the adoption of BBNJ in June 2023, civil society has continuously supported capacity building efforts, particularly for developing countries and small delegations to ensure that they can participate meaningfully in the processes. And the agreement explicitly says that observer participation shall not be unduly restricted. But of course, on how we define unduly restrictive, we could see some diverse views on that. And so this one issue will definitely be followed to ensure that countries will agree on the rules on observer participation that are consistent with the principle of the agreement.
Thanks, Riza. Maybe I will just switch the conversation a little bit into where the treaty is going in terms of what action on the water will look like, or what it will change, and we can come back to some more of these discussions a little bit as they are really relevant. But one of the questions that was put into the chat was around marine protected areas or marine protection. And ultimately, the treaty is about protecting biodiversity and sustainably using and sharing those benefits for all. So maybe I can turn to Cal at this point to talk a little bit about what states can already start doing now, even before some of these institutions are established, to prepare strong science-based MPA proposals, even before COP1 and during this PrepCom process development this year.
Hello, Beck. Thank you for the question. Good morning, everyone. So that's a very important question, and the last part of it is even more critical. In order to plan for robust MPAs, the work has to start yesterday, essentially. So for a robust MPA proposal, we're guided in the agreement by a set of criteria. So it has to be, essentially, it has three key chunk of elements. So we need some ecological and biological values. So essentially, why is a site worth saving? But we also need to identify whether there are pressures or even threats to an area that will warrant some management measures. And then we have also to consider what are the different measures to put in place, but also what are the tools that will be available and the means to achieve them. So finance, but also means for monitoring, conservation, control, surveillance, as well as enforcement. All this are critical. But most importantly, the proposal development is the most critical phase, and one of the key elements is the inclusivity and bringing around the table the different stakeholders that have some stake in an area. So that inclusivity part shouldn't be an afterthought, but definitely has to be built into any thought of a potential proposal. So it's essentially about talk, but not just talk, also working together. And that's very important to stress that, because once an MPA will be established, it will be the prerogative of not just one state who has potentially championed that area, but it will be something that will need to be embraced by the whole community, the whole BBNJ community. So really wanted to stress that. And so inclusivity here, what does it mean? Well, it means, of course, engaging with the scientific community to build a case, to get the data. It's also building with rights holders as well as traditional holders when there are traditional knowledge associated with a particular place that's also is there to complement science in determining the value of an area. Of course, a critical stakeholder is, of course, civil society. We can't do anything without civil society. And so where some of our members are already engaged on some potential sites. But also, of course, and I saw some of the questions here, some of the sectoral actors. So that includes not just states who have some interest in the particular areas, but also sectoral organizations. And we're thinking, of course, a lot about regional fisheries management organizations. So these have to be brought at the table, not just the RFMOs, so the institutions, but also the states and the sectoral actors there, the private sectors there. Also important are the other BBNJ parties, especially the adjacent coastal states who are or may not yet be BBNJ parties, but it's really about co-constructing a proposal before it's even submitted in the official process of the BBNJ. So again, I stress that this is very critical because it's like preparing to sail when you go out without having ensured that your vessel is robust and adequate for the water that you're about to sail, that your crew is not trained, but also might not be willing to go on the journey with you if you don't have adequate provisions for food and drinks, or if you don't even know the charts of your journey, you don't know the waters where you're going, you haven't asked the right questions, then you're sure that your journey is going to crash. And so preparing an MPA, especially in the context of BBNJ, is particularly in need of robust plan. So that will require substantial efforts and substantial means. But more importantly, also, well, there's a lot of importantly, but to bring it back to the previous discussions with the two co-chairs, the work that is currently done at the PrepCom and soon to be at the COP is extremely important to ensure robust proposals. And that is about building the right institutions as well as the right processes to ensure that the processes relating to the establishment of MPAs are robust. So that is to ensure that we equipped the agreement with the right institutions that are effective, that are efficient, and can do efficient work and decision modalities. That is particularly the case with the scientific and technical body that will have a critical role to play in the establishment of ABMTs. So area-based management tools, as well as marine protected areas that will ensure that we can start really the work as soon as possible. And so that's also the responsibility of the current BBNJ parties and those soon to become parties. So the work at the PrepCom and the COP are extremely important in that regard. Some of our members at the High Seas Alliance have worked already and are working, as Riza mentioned, to support parties to BBNJs and countries engaged in the PrepCom. And so we're also as civil society doing our role in supporting parties to ensure that we have the right institutions in place and the right processes in place for effective MPA establishment. On the question on how soon we could see protection on the waters, That's a complex question because there is protection on paper, and that we could see by COP2 having something, but that might not necessarily mean that it's robust, and so that's why we need to have strong institutions in place, and we need that coordination and that collaboration with different stakeholders, including other organizations during the development phase. That will ensure that once proposal is agreed by the COP, then it has the adequate support and can actually be managed, and thus protection can be effectively implemented. That's very important. When we talk about protection, we have to look at effective implementation. We also have to understand that protection is also managing or preventing potential damage from activities. And just to indicate here that on Saturday, Part 4 of the agreement on environmental impact assessment will essentially enter into force. And so here we already have a tool to ensure that activities that will take place in areas beyond national jurisdiction that might have an impact on biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction are going through a robust environmental impact assessment process. And so we can mitigate potential impacts of those activities. So essentially, protection will start hopefully on Saturday.
Thanks, Kat. That was very thorough in terms of, I think, the very key message that we need effective protection, and very well prepared marine protected area proposals is really, really essential before you even get to the kind of formality process within the BBNJ agreement. Maybe before we go back to some more questions around the PrepCom and COP, we'll just continue down this MPA line for a minute. What, besides the question of how soon could we get protection, obviously there has already been some work done on identifying potential sites that are ecologically significant. Could you maybe just touch on some of the places or kinds of ecosystems that have been identified as ecologically significant or important to protect as a priority, and give some examples of states or those places that are starting to progress work there?
Thanks, Beck. Maybe it's because it's 4 a.m. My time, but I feel like this is a difficult question, especially when it's about priority sites. In my ocean-loving mind, the whole ocean has to be protected. We have seen the science, but of course we have to be strategic and we have to pick some places. Luckily there are a few, and I assume that more sites will emerge in the future. So before revealing who some of the sites are, just to mention that we are guided by the agreement with Annex 1. There are some criteria. It's not just about again the ecological and biological significance. There's also some cultural values, but there's also, as mentioned, some pressures. In addition to that, we also have to recognize that the ocean is diverse, that there are different habitats and ecosystems, all have their values, all have their uniqueness. And so the idea, and it's also in the agreement, that we are aiming towards establishing a network of ecologically representative marine protected areas. So it's around the world. Ultimately, we would also see the BBNJ agreement as a key contributor to achieving 30 by 30, so 30% of ocean protected by 2030, which is under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And here too, there is this idea of ecologically connected networks of MPA. So that just wanted to keep that in mind. But currently, there are about 20-ish sites around the world that could potentially become first generation of MPAs. All are in different stages of advancement when it is about developing proposals. Are ideas of, and already they're champions, and by champions I mean some countries, the development of a proposal and are already engaging with some stakeholders. And that's around the world. So we have, for instance, the thermal dome of the coast of Central America. There is also Salas y Gomez and Nazca Ridges of the coast of South America. There is the Lord Howe Rise in South Tasmanian Sea between Australia and New Zealand. There is also the Canary Currents of the coast of West Africa in the Atlantic zone. And we also have one in West Indian Ocean, subantarctica, close to Prince Edward Island, Crozet and Kerguelen Islands. And again, 20 sites around the world. Many of these sites already have some champions, more or less, who have more or less indicated that they will develop proposals. Again, some are exploring the idea of and talking with scientists and organizing workshops just to see whether or not it's worthy or it's a good site. There are a few groups of countries who have come together in order to champion BBNJ. And one in particular is championing the establishment of the first generation of MPAs, and that's the First Movers Group, which is some countries. Not all are parties yet to BBNJs, but they come together and they share their views and their projects on promoting MPA sites. It was established by Chile and has about, I want to say 20 countries, but I'm not really sure yet. I don't know if do we want more details, the whole list of potential sites, or?
No, I think that's good. We can move back to some more of the kind of process discussions and questions now. Thanks to Cal. I think that was a really good comprehensive outline of the potential for a connected network of marine protected areas globally in the high seas. Maybe if we can just shift back now, Janine, to you and Adam on some of the process questions. One of the big questions that is hot on everybody's lips is, when will the first conference of the parties be, and when will it be decided if you don't know already?
So we can't preempt what the PrepCom will do, but go ahead, Adam.
I think we're about to say the same thing. We can tell you when it will be by, which is it must be held under the terms of the agreement within the year of the agreement entering into force. So the COP must be held by 17 January 2027 at the latest. But then beyond that, it's going to be obviously a decision for those participating in the PrepCom, and subject no doubt to a lot of discussion. So Janine, did you have anything to add to that?
We could narrow it even further. It won't be during the PrepCom.
Yeah,
so it'll have to be after April and before January 17, 2027. So I think looking towards the second half of the 2026 and early 2027 is probably where we'll find some dates. And of course, we have to make sure that it's just timed appropriately so there are no overlapping meetings because we anticipate that there will be a lot of interest in participation in COP1.
Yeah.
And can you just extend on that for the benefit of the journalists? What are some of the key decisions that countries will make at that first COP, which will motivate them to join the COP and or to have ratified by the first COP?
Essentially, the COP will be deciding the rules of the engagement in the Conference of the Parties. So you heard from Takao already the significant amount of interest in many different parts of the world on how the ocean space can best be managed, protected, and sustainably used. So those invested in ensuring that they're able to participate will want to be at COP1. There's a lot of interest as well in capacity building, technology transfer to support some of these very processes that we've heard about. Again, at COP1, we will be deciding the processes to enable capacity building and technology transfer. There are those who are interested in marine scientific research and what that can contribute to developments in many different areas in conservation, but also in other innovative spaces, innovative industries. And at COP1, we will again be deciding on the terms for the engagement around access and benefit sharing. So the Conference of the Parties will be an important launch pad for all the processes and all the arrangements that will make the BBNJ function to deliver on the promises that were set out as in the agreement itself.
Thanks, Janine. And can you confirm, do you know where the first COP will be held at this point, if not exactly when? Will it be held at the UN headquarters in New York? Adam is nodding.
I think that's yes. It will be
Right.
held at the UN headquarters in New York, unless Janine wants to correct me on that. I think that's provided for that the first copy is held in New York.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Just good to confirm. And I'm just cycling through some of the questions that are in the chat and the Q&A now. In terms of the Secretariat, there's a question on where will the Secretariat be located? Perhaps you can't answer that just yet, but you could perhaps answer when when there will be a decision on who will host the Secretariat and ultimately where it will be held.
Well, it's a good question. Under the agreement, the decision on the hosting of the Secretariat will be taken at the first COP, but there is a question of how. So the formal decision will be taken there. There's a question of how much is prepared, the ground prepared beforehand. At the moment, there are 3 separate bids to host the Secretariat. So one is Valparaiso in Chile. Another is Brussels in Belgium. There's a hybrid proposal, I think you'd call it, that involves UNEP that is a third candidate. And of course, there's a possibility that other candidates will emerge. But a decision has to be taken by the first COP. The question then becomes whether it will have emerged at some time before then that, there's a preferred option, depending on the views of members. But we'll know it is one of the mandatory decisions for COP1.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There's quite a few questions that we won't have time to get through. We can, of course, answer questions to journalists via email. But I'm just thinking in terms of maybe one of the other questions to answer, which I frequently get, is around the enforcement of the treaty and the in compliance of the treaty, how that will occur, and who will ensure the treaty is enforced, and how is it? Is there punitive responses for non-compliance? I don't know if Janine, you want to answer
Sure.
that.
So there are the different parts to the agreement which state parties and those regional entities that join have to implement. And there are also requirements for reporting in different ways, reporting through committees, reporting to the COP, and those are also going to be critical in terms of compliance. But I think, there are unique parts to each agreement, to each unique aspects to each part of the agreement that need to be taken into consideration when talking about compliance. So, for instance, Part 2 of the agreement, which deals with marine genetic resources, has a specific section that deals with monitoring and transparency. The area-based management tools provision also has a provision that deals with reporting, and there's a role there for the scientific and technical body. With regards to capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, that too will have its own system of reporting. And finally, there's an institutional arrangement that will address compliance, and it's called a compliance committee. And that also has to be constituted by COP1. So there are many different aspects of dealing with compliance. What I will state is that there has been a general trend in multilateral environmental agreements to move away from punitive measures and to actually push for more facilitative measures. And the BBNJ is no exception in that regard. So I think rather than look into punitive aspects of to encourage implementation or to push for implementation, there is more a focus on the facilitative measures to encourage implementation. I hope that answers the question.
Excellent. Thanks, Janine. There was a question on the impact on, I think we touched on it in terms of the challenges, in terms of the impact of BBNJ or the High Seas Treaty on how fisheries management is done globally currently, and the impact on decisions around deep sea mining as well, which are currently also managed through the International Seabed Authority, and obviously fisheries are managed through the regional fisheries management authorities. There may not be black and white answers because, as I think Janine, you and Anna, you pointed out at the beginning, these are some of the challenges of BBNJ, right? This is where there is the ambition and the opportunity to improve current practices, but also in so doing poses some challenges. I don't know, Janine or Adam, if you wanted to make any comments around that. I think, Adam, you also talked about it in terms of cooperation with other bodies at the beginning. So if you just wanted to make any other comments around the impact or the implications for high seas fisheries and deep sea mining decisions with BBNJ's entry into force.
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and I think there's a couple of points there. Certainly, BBNJ is very ambitious, but there are certain defined limits. So under UNCLOS, the seabed mining regime was established under what's called Part 2 of UNCLOS, which established the International Seabed Authority. So, I mean, everything sort of below the surface on the seabed is the responsibility of the ISA. BBNJ covers what's called the water column, everything that's in the water, and everything that lives on the seabed floor. So, for instance, if there's a question of mining in the substrata or on the seabed, that simply belongs to the ISA. It's not something where the BBNJ gets a role. It's just how UNCLOS was negotiated many years ago. On other questions, there then becomes, there are, of course, a variety of regional fisheries management organisations. They cover specific areas and specific species. BBNJ is not a fisheries agreement. It's a marine genetic resources agreement, which is quite different. But all of these interactions will have to be worked through. But some things are quite clearly, for want of a better word, out of scope for BBNJ. But then there's a whole range of areas where there's sort of where the various regimes will bump up against each other. That's where we will have to sort of, RFMOs are a good example of where we will have discussions and we will have to figure out what the interlay is. But there's not, I think, an RFMO that kind of covers, comprehensively all species in any given part of the world. By definition, there are always bits of the ocean covering particular species. That's why when you talk about the 30 by 30 goal, that's where MPAs are so important, because I think it's just a statement of mathematics that you can't get to 30 by 30 without MPAs coming down the pipeline of BBNJ. I don't think it's mathematically possible. So, it's the MPA component, the BBNJ MPA component of that picture is going to be absolutely vital.
Thanks, Adam. And I have been a very poor moderator. I'm sorry, it's 2 minutes past the hour, but I was trying to answer as many questions as possible. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for your insights and sharing your expertise. For all of the journalists online, we will copy down some of the questions that we didn't get to and attempt to answer them via email. We'll also make a recording, or make the recording of this webinar available online and share that. There is a media pack available as well, with a press release and a Q&A that will be circulated to participants. And I just wanted to highlight, one of the questions was, is there an event to celebrate the entry into force? And we are having, I wish it were, a champagne party, but unfortunately we're all over the world, or fortunately we're all over the world. So we will be having a celebratory webinar on Monday the 19th, because the entry into force occurs on Saturday the 17th, and people may have other plans. So we will put a link to that celebratory webinar into the chat and into the press pack as well, and encourage everyone to join. It'll be fun. There'll be entertainment as well as important information. And really just want to highlight that the next big step, we've really successfully made massive progress in the last 2 and a bit years by getting to this point of over 60 ratifications, now 80, and the entry into force, the coming into international law of the High Seas Treaty, but it's really critical that we go from 60 to global, and that we get universal ratification from all states, because that will make the treaty and all of the opportunity and ambition in terms of biodiversity protection and fair and equitable access to the ocean benefits most achievable and most likely. So that will be one of our biggest goals for this year. And yeah, thank you so much for joining the this media briefing, for hopefully covering this incredibly important and significant moment, a once in a generation change to global ocean governance. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to email us. I think that is all of the contents. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy High Seas Treaty.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thanks a lot.